actually wanted to post another video here. It was I guess, in reference to the video that I actually just recently reposted in response to a viewer that actually commented on a video of mine regarding a response video that I did as far as blacks and the slavery mindset. I didn't actually want to go back and actually talk anymore about the subject, but again, from the response that I got from this particular person, I felt that I guess I had to go back and explore a topic again that I did not really want to talk about, which is of course the issue regarding slavery. Now again, we already know pretty much, or I hate to use the word slavery, but I would use the technical term enslavement of African Americans. When I actually went in there and actually was talking about that particular issue, I actually was going back and actually didn't want to explore on the issue of white privilege, but I guess with that being said, and then slavery, all of that is kind of enrolled into one, so I actually wanted to go back and really explain what I really meant by the entire issue as far as white privilege and and that sort of thing. So with this video, I'm just going to have to go in and just kind of explain that particular one. But again, we already know the history about slavery, where blacks and black African American women and men were pretty much actually at the hands of white folks for the most part, where pretty much that was not really a time of actually, I guess, well, actually, I think it was a time of empowerment for black men and black women, because again, it taught them how to be unified and actually work together to overcome the oppression that was placed on them by the quote-unquote white man. But again, there's a lot of issues and things that actually that blacks, again, black men and black women faced during that particular time in American history. And see, one of the things about it is that we are running across in this day and time a lot of issues and things that actually, and a lot of the things that we're facing today, that are as a result of, who we are. And basically, we cannot, as black men and black women, we cannot actually ignore the effects of what slavery was and how it actually shaped us into the people that we are. One of the main things that we actually have to know and understand is that, we each race has a unique history about itself. And for the most part, African Americans, pretty much our heritage, for the most part, if you're going to use that word, it's actually, intertwined into actually being over and brought from, over other continents to be used, as slaves. When you talk to the typical African American, whether it be a man or a woman, we don't really want to focus that much on that particular aspect of our, of our being, because again, that's not a thing that we would like to talk about. But again, I think with this particular issue is I think that it's actually very important that we talk about it, because again, it can bring about a better understanding of who we are, and of course how we can better appreciate who we are and our contributions to society, even though a lot of folks do not want to actually admit to the upcoming and the the overcoming of slavery that was given to us as black folk. A major hallmark in the American Revolution was actually when they, I guess it was when they actually passed a law that to make it illegal to actually own slaves. And for the most part, for the African American man and woman, that pretty much meant that this was the embarkation, I should say, of actually being able to be independent and actually being able to contribute to society, just like the the quote-unquote black man and the black woman, or I should say the people in white society. Again, this was supposed to have been a triumph for the African American community, where they were able to go out and make things happen on their own. But again, there was a lot of issues that a lot of white folks actually had with the abolition of slavery, because again, they felt that that they actually had a quote unquote perceived right to actually own black folk. And see, one thing about it again is that for us African Americans in this day and time, we have to understand that when we have a lot of people who, like I guess our great grandpas, great grandmas, or what have you, that was actually able to live through and actually tell the story of how they quote unquote made it over. I think it's actually something that is worth sitting down and listening to. Again, when they I guess first approved, or actually wrote it in the Constitution that it was actually, again, illegal to own slaves, there was a major shift in the dynamics of how society was actually going to be ran, and how the white man was actually going to quote unquote treat the black folk when this law came into being. For the most part, even though the white folks for the most part did not have power over the black folks, they didn't really want to leave it at that. They really actually wanted to still execute their power over white folks, over African Americans, but they actually wanted to do it in an underhanded way. And see, one thing about it, again, that is where you actually came into the subject of actually racism. And see, racism, in my opinion, is actually slavery in a sense that's being hidden under the carpet, or I should say that's being swept under the carpet, and where it's still where you're trying to exuberate power over someone else. And see, again, when you're talking about racism, we already know what the concept of racism is all about. That's when you actually say that one race is superior to another, or where we quote unquote say the expression white privilege. Here we go again with that. Pretty much what it was is that was the belief that, of course, I'm better than you because, again, I'm entitled to certain services and such, and actually entitled to be treated a certain way because of who I am. And see, one thing about it is that when you actually have people that actually believed in that, which was very heavily done back there in that time of American Revolution or American history, that's when it pretty much actually still began to, I guess, create a very still visible divide between the community, meaning the white society and black folk. Even though abolition was pretty much, or the abolishment of slavery was actually done, the slave mentality was still actually very prevalent in society because, again, the treatment that black folks had actually endured. And what I mean by that is, even though there was no way that a white man can actually own a black person, the black man, in my opinion, still actually operated under the mindset of actually being a slave. Because, again, with you being, like, I guess, in a cage all this time and then you're all of a sudden let free, you're still going to live in a way to really think that you're still actually at the hands of your captors. And I think that was the mind frame of a lot of African Americans during that time in American Revolution. White privilege is another area within this whole concept of actually slavery that we actually need to really focus on and actually really talk about for a little bit. For the most part, when I actually responded to the gentleman, or when that prompted me to, or I should say that actually inspired me to do this video, when I meant by white privilege is the system that was in place to actually keep African Americans actually on the back burner, so to speak, where they did not actually have any rights for the most part, or they were actually believed to not have any rights based on the actions of white society. Even though we, discussed the abolition or the abolishment of slavery, pretty much white privilege is pretty much something that was actually used to negate what the law actually said was supposed to be, or at least in my opinion. Again, white privilege was set in place, again, which is, in my opinion, a group of systems that was put in place to actually, I guess, hinder blacks from progressing or moving up in society, to actually make them actually available for things that pretty much that were already given and already available to white folks. And for the most part, I really don't like the word that concept white privilege, because it makes it seem as if it's a privilege to be white. And see, for the most part, whenever I would listen to videos in the past where they would talk about white privilege and such, it would always kind of leave me on the edge of my seat, wanting to actually just cringe and just really almost like really want to scream, because, again, it was like it made it seem as if blacks did not contribute to society, that blacks did not have a place in society, and that blacks really did not belong in society. For the most part, again, you had a lot of systems that were in place, to kind of keep the black folks down, which, of course, for the most part, which was the whole thing with the education concept and everything like that, which of course I'll get into in a little bit. But anyway, again, for the most part, white privilege, again, was one of those things that I consider, again, to be kind of like a system that really kept blacks in the mindset of actually being in slavery, even though they passed a law already to abolish slavery. Anytime you actually teach someone or actually show someone time and time again that you're better than they are, and that pretty much that I have access to systems that you won't never have access to, that kind of puts the other person or the other race at a disadvantage, meaning that they are starting to think now that, okay, maybe they are right. Maybe I don't have a right to do this, or maybe I don't have a right to actually participate in that, or what have you. But even though, again, the law passed where they had actually made it illegally to own slaves, white privilege actually was set in place for the white man to not only still kind of keep that concept of racism going, but it was their kind of way of underhandedly keeping it that way, and actually still keeping the blacks in the mindset of being a slave. That's my personal opinion. And again, you can feel free to disagree. That's totally fine. But again, as always, I always say that this is my video. I can pretty much say what I want. But again, it's just the fact that we just have to really understand what it was all about. And again, when you have a lot of people that post videos these days regarding white privilege, they will be quick to tell you, or they will actually be quick to negate, that it exists. And see, one thing about it is that, and I was also accused in my last video of actually not for actually saying that it didn't exist. And I'm like, I don't understand where that insinuation came from, because again, I'm always the first to say, and admit that white privilege did exist, racism did exist. Just because, again, that we choose to sometimes want to ignore it or actually pretend that it's not there, that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. But again, white privilege, for the most part, unfortunately, had its place in society, even though the law was passed to abolish slavery. To wrap it up, white privilege was a group of systems that was set in place to kind of keep the African Americans in a state of actually still being enslaved in the mind, even though laws were already passed for them to say, okay, you are no longer under rulership of white society or the white man. For the most part, also, I wanted to actually talk about, again, what the system actually developed for African Americans or any minority to negate white privilege, and that was the concept of affirmative action. When you talk about affirmative action, a lot of people don't like to really talk about that or actually really want to spend a great detail of actually researching to find out what its true purpose was all about. But one thing about it is that, again, even though affirmative action was very big, back in the I would say in the 60s, 70s time frame, because again, it was pretty much the same thing that white privilege was, except that it was actually really for the African Americans or other minorities or whatever the case may be. But again, it was the same thing, the same concept, where it was a system that was set in place to, I guess, guarantee equal treatment of African Americans or any other minorities when it comes to, their European counterpart. And for the most part, that was a system that was set in place that really was despised by white society, because now, African Americans really had something to fight, or had something in their corner to fight with whenever they felt that they were actually being discriminated against or actually being judged based on the color of their skin when it came to employment opportunities and such like that. But again, it was a system that was set in place, to negate what white privilege gave to white society. And see, a lot of times, even though you don't really hear about affirmative action much these days, you still actually have that concept still really in play for the most part, even though it may not be mentioned by concept. And see, again, that was, again, something that was set in the corner for blacks and other, minorities to actually use whenever they felt that they were actually, being rightfully, well, not rightfully, but when they were actually being, wrongfully withheld from certain things because of the color of their skin or because of who they are. Again, with that being said, affirmative action did come a long way, and it actually opened a lot of doors for a lot of people, to get into areas in society where, white society said that blacks or other minorities didn't belong. And, and again, the African American community really, should have a lot of great things to say about it, because, as of course, nobody else has really anything great to say about it because of what it actually stood for. But see, the thing about it is that why in the world would white society get angry for actually having a system in place so that someone else can be seen as quote unquote being equal? And see, the thing about it, here we go again, is the fact that you're going back to the whole concept of what slavery did and and how it left a bad taste in the mouth of African Americans, and how it actually left a favorable taste in the minds of pretty much most white folk. Because again, slavery was a way for not only the black folks to actually be enslaved physically, it was also a way for them to be enslaved mentally as well. When you're constantly being told that you're never going to be anything, you're going to always be under my feet, and you're being whipped, all for the sake of actually, for just showing that you can exuberate your power over somebody, and then when something comes along to say, you can no longer take our power away from us, we're trying to get back what you're taking from us, again, they, I guess in their opinion, they had a reason to get upset. But again, one thing about it is that affirmative action made a lot of things possible for, the African American and other minority community to move up. And one of those things is also, again, as I mentioned once before, in the area of education. Education is one of those main hallmarks and staple, that pretty much is the gateway, so to speak, for, a lot of opportunities that may exist in, society. But even with that, you also had, African Americans that were pretty much discriminated against as far as the admissions process in prestigious colleges, where they felt that that type of environment or that those type of people, so to speak, did not belong in, their certain financial institutions. And see, one thing about it, again, here we go, affirmative action would had to be, set in place to let them know that, okay, don't judge me based on the color of my skin. Look at my test scores. Look at all this, that, and the other, and know that I am just as equally as talented as your white folks that you have going to this particular institution. Again, in my opinion, I believe that white folks really hate that word affirmative action. And and it's sad to say there's not really much that can be done about that. Just like they hate the NAACP for the most part, in my opinion, because it stands for the equal treatment of black folks and any other folks that happens to be non-white. And again, society in this day and time, even though they may not outwardly admit it, they despise that concept all to its core, because again, it takes power away from them, I should say the power that they thought that they once had, and actually allows now the power to rest with minorities. And again, in my opinion, affirmative action actually started that. But again, with the education piece, you have a lot of people now, again, that are being able to go to school, and and now again, with them being able to be allowed to attend prestigious institutions like Yale, MIT, all of these other, other just many different institutions of higher learning. Now we actually, once they graduate, now we're actually looking at the possibility of now finding a job. And see, one thing about it now is that when you're trying to look for a job now, it's almost like a scarcity these days, because now it's like we're still at a kind of like at a slope now, again, where we're looking at a higher unemployment rate of black folks, in the job market. And see, the thing about it again is that now, the sad part to say is that now that we've actually crossed over one hurdle, which was actually being able to get degrees, and we're actually increasing our numbers in getting degrees, now it's all about now being able to find a job now to use those degrees. And for the most part, a lot of African Americans now are still actually at the state of actually being, I should say, at the bottom, I should say, of the pole as far as actually when it comes to job selection. Because again, white privilege in a sense, and I hate to admit that, but it's actually still being used in an underhanded way to exclude certain people from getting certain jobs. I believe that really a lot of that has to do with, again, a lot of it has to do with has a lot to do with the way human resources is being ran in some companies, and it also has a lot to do with what type of perception people have when they actually have a white person walking in or a black person walking in their door to sit down for an interview. So again, you have to kind of really look at these things and really understand what's going on here and what is at stake here. Again, even though you have a college degree, which was the common myth, is that it would guarantee you a nice life, a nice living and stuff. As we know these days, that is simply not the case. So with that being said, and we know that that's not the case, and that again, you still have a lot of discrimination going on even in this day and time. Now you're actually having a lot of black folks that are going out and making things happen on their own. You have a lot of them that are becoming CEOs and and going out and actually becoming entrepreneurs, making their own dreams a reality, which takes hard work. But you have a lot of them that are going out there young, black, owning different companies. I mean, making that money, which is something to be very proud of, because again, it wasn't too long ago where we were never thought of to actually reach such a area in our lives in this point in history. Again, you have a lot of people that are going out and actually making, becoming millionaires in other ways, in music. Again, you cannot sit there and actually hold somebody down when they actually have the talent and the know-how on how to do things. Not only are they making, music, now they're even also venturing into television, again, where they're becoming owners of, international TV spots that are viewed by every household in America. It's a beautiful thing to behold, and it's something to actually be proud of, especially knowing our history, in the United States. One of the most interesting things about slavery within itself, and again, it is not one of the highest points of remembrance as far as African Americans are concerned, is the mindset that actually goes into as the result of actually being enslaved for so long. One of the main things about the human personality is that you can actually control somebody and how they think and how they feel about themselves, based on what they accept, and of course what you put out to them when you're, as far as when you're in a setting as far as enslavement. It is my belief that when you're constantly actually telling someone that they'll actually never be worth anything, if they'll never amount to anything, they'll always be, at the bottom of your shoe. You know, they'll never get anything out of life. They'll never be productive, that sort of thing. When it's actually a repeated action, when it's given to you over and over and over and over again, you know, pretty much, sad to say, we begin to accept that belief and actually begin to, you know, associate and behave in the way that, you know, as far as the words that we accept. And see, one of the main things is that when a lot of people try to, you know, I guess belittle or try to, I guess, how do you say, trivialize slavery, pretty much in as far as African Americans concerned, that's pretty much of insult to who we are for the most part. And the reason why I say that is because, again, you know, you cannot sit there and belittle something, or, you know, without actually, you know, being involved in it or actually knowing how it feels to be a victim of it. And see, one of the main things here is that the mindset that was actually given to blacks, whether it be male or female, is the fact, you know, as is an effect of the harsh treatment and the enduring, you know, of the hardships and such of what they endured when they were enslaved by white folks. See, one thing again, as and see, the mind is a very intricate thing. Is that whenever you actually begin to really be, you know, really begin to be told something, and again, it doesn't matter at this point in time. It doesn't really matter how you feel about yourself. It's what you're listening to. It's what you're actually being around. It's what you're being familiar with. And see, one thing about it is that during the enslavement of African Americans, they were constantly being berated, you know, ridiculed, being, you know, talked down to, pretty much just being treated like just bare trash. And then not on top of that, actually being, you know, the brunt of all jokes, you know, and actually just being able to sit there and witness these people actually saying these horrible things to you, you know, and that sort of thing. And then, you know, and today, you know, when you're talking about it, you have a lot of people that will sit there and, for the most part, and say, oh, you know, slavery ended some time ago, get over it. To those people, you can't really get over it. It's not, and the reason why I said it is because, again, that was an action that was actually a dramatic action that was done and actually really transform us African Americans, for the most part, I hate to say it, into who we are and the way that we think for the most part in this day and time. Even though we personally these days may not have endured slavery for the most part, you know, we pretty much have relatives who actually were involved in slavery and can actually sit there and tell you what it was all about and pretty much the hardships and the constant things that they had to endure at the hand of white folks. And see, one thing about it is that the sad part about it is that when you begin to listen to these stories, you know, of how, you know, they had to get away and how they actually had to, you know, endure rape and, you know, the black man being emasculated right in front of his woman. I mean, it's almost too much to bear. And see, one thing about it is that, again, and you can't help but get emotional when you're telling these stories, and actually, and for the receiver, for the person that's listening, you can't help but get also emotional, because, again, that was something that really that no human being should have endured. How in the world can you sit there and actually treat a human being like that? How can you sit there and tell a human being that, you know, you will always be my boy, you will always, go tend to the fields and all this other type of stuff, you know, and it's like, again, that's where, you know, we as black folks really have adopted that mindset. And see, one thing about it is that, again, you know, even though slavery has ended some time ago, we still operate for the most part in the mindset of actually being enslaved. And the reason why I say that is because of the way that we actually conduct ourselves, the way that we play the victim, the way that we do this, that, and the other when it comes to actually living in today's society. Again, you know, we have to stop actually being able to, you know, to look at ourselves as being second-class citizens. Because, again, once with the abolition of slavery, pretty much the shackles were off for the most part. Even though, you know, white society slowly had to transform and actually realize and understand that, hey, you no longer own me. I am actually a free, sovereign human being and can go out and make things happen on my own. It's the fact that we have to be able to adapt that mindset and be able to live in that mindset. And again, we have a lot of African Americans that are still trailing behind white folks, and they're like, and the funny thing about it is that when you're asked, or when you ask a typical black person, you know, why are you still living beyond your, you know, below means, or whatever the case may be, you know, there are some things that we know that we can't, you know, control, like, you know, employment, you know, famine, you know, those type of things. But again, as far as the things that we can control, the first thing that we'll say, you know, for the most part, if we're able to do something about it, is that, you know, the white man is trying to hold me down. And see, one thing about it, again, when I hear somebody of an African American descent that says that, you know, okay, you really have to examine and really look at the entire picture of what it's all about. I cannot sit there and say that, for the most part, with all the choices that are given to me as an African American individual these days in time, as opposed to, years back, I cannot sit there and say, what, and even though, now, I'll say this. That is not to deny that white privilege still exists. That's not what I'm saying. But the fact about it is that when you're sitting up there and you're actually not being as productive as you could possibly be, and the first thing that comes to mind is that you want to blame the white man, to me that's foul. Because again, you have the same opportunities, and the main ones who are saying these things are the ones who are not even trying to go out there and even trying to make something out themselves. They sit there, want to be lazy. They sit there, want to, rely on government assistance and all these other type of things, to help them get by. And see, one thing about it, that when they're asked or called on the carpet for their actions, as far as them actually being up and being productive, they want to all of a sudden give the excuse of, well, the white man is not trying to help me. Well, no, nobody's going to want to help you, white, black, Chinese, or Latino, if you're not willing to help yourself. The truth of the matter is, again, is that doors can be open, but you have to actually work for those doors to be open. Nothing is actually going to be handed to you, And see, one thing about it, that we as black folks, we have this chip on our shoulder sometimes. It's like this entitlement issue that we walk around, that we're supposed to be entitled to certain things because of what our ancestors may have endured. Again, when people sit there and talk about slavery and the mindsets and stuff, I don't get offended. Because again, why in the world would I get offended about something that I was not personally involved in? One thing about it is that we all have to give an account to God for our actions and what we've done in this body here on earth. And for the most part, you have a lot of black folks that are still walking around with that ingrown hate that was taught to them from their parents and grandparents because of something that they may have endured that haven't happened to you. I cannot go back and change what happened in slavery. It's a sad thing, but also it's an educational thing to let us know who we are as African Americans. But in that, I'm able to actually keep it within its realm to let me know that I cannot let the past dictate who I am now and how I want to live my life in the future. You have a lot of people, African Americans, that are still living in that mindset of, I'm still, under the white man's feet. So there's no need in me even trying, because again, I'm going to, always end up at the bottom. If you really continue to think that way, then so be it. The Bible says, whatsoever man thinketh, so is he. So if you want to sit there and think that way, then that's totally up to you, and that's on you, and you cannot blame anybody else for that mindset, because that's something that you've adopted. See, one thing about it is that when the slaves and the African Americans were actually, pretty much, quote unquote, enslaved, this was a learned process for them. This process was actually beat into them that they were not going to be anything. And the same way that process and that lie was ingrained and actually learned through the African American mind, when the abolition law came into effect, that was something that we actually had to keep us so we can actually deprogram what the white man wanted to program into our minds as far as us not being worth anything. And see, one thing about it is that you still have African Americans that still have not unlearned that type of mentality. Again, when you enslave somebody's mind, and I mean the way that they did it back in, in slavery times, that was something, and it's like you can almost understand why it's so hard to let go now. But the point about it is that we have to learn to let it go, because again, when you're sitting up there holding on to the wrongs that was done to you, and you're using that as an excuse for you not to progress into the future, all you're doing is holding yourself back. You're not really progressing. All you're doing is making excuses as to the reason why you can't get, what is for you. Again, yes, slavery ended. Yes, the mindset that was ingrained through the slavery, it's a powerful thing. And again, it's so powerful, they have, they talk about it in history books, a part of the American Revolution, because again, that was a major issue and a major occurrence in American Revolution that pretty much shaped us black folks, again, to who we are today. But again, for the most part, I look at that as actually transforming and actually having it to actually be another aspect of, African American culture where we're actually able to, learn something from. So again, we have to really understand and put it in its proper place and know, okay, yes, slavery, yes, it was a horrible thing. And again, it was even more terrible because of the mindset that it put the black folks in. But again, we have to understand that when the laws were changed, those chains came off. Now, again, if you want to keep those chains on you through the way that you think, then that's totally on you, and you cannot really blame anybody else for that. I want to actually talk about another issue that actually falls under the umbrella of white privilege, and pretty much that actually has a lot to do with, the injustices that African Americans face in public society. Regarding, I guess when crimes are committed or that sort of thing, they're automatically on the offense or quick to say that, an African American may have, committed the crime, as opposed to their white counterparts. One thing that we have to understand is that we understand that the world isn't perfect and that, everybody has their own way and own choice of how they view different races and such. But for some reason, I just don't understand why is it that anytime a crime is committed, everybody all of a sudden wants to point to the black man to say, okay, they're the ones that's guilty of the crime. And that's one of the main things and one of the, I guess, heartaches that we as African Americans face on a day-to-day basis, pretty much being accused just because of our skin color. And again, even though that is a very, I guess, terrible thing to actually wake up to, or actually, be able to wake up to find yourself in, but that is the realization for a lot of African Americans, and unfortunately there's not really much that we can do about it. But again, when you're talking about racial profiling, you really have to actually take it within, a context and really give a specific example of, pretty much racial profiling gone wrong. Now, I don't know if you all remember, pretty much back in, I guess, the early 90s or such, where, there was like a big beef or a big issue regarding, racism and such, especially on the West Coast, because of an issue that actually happened where there was actually the beating of Rodney King, where these police officers wanted to pull him over. I think it was for speeding or something like that. I don't know what the circumstances was, but pretty much they pulled him over, and for the most part, they began to beat this poor fellow profusely. It's like, and when you sit there and actually watch that, and I'm pretty sure they have clips of that on YouTube, I'm sure, somewhere around here on there, but I'm pretty sure that when you're actually sitting up there looking at how these cops are, wailing on this poor fellow with those nightsticks, and they're just beating him relentlessly till he just can't really move anymore. It's like, how in the world can somebody survive such an attack? And I mean, the funny thing about it is that, it wasn't one cop. I mean, you actually had a bunch of cops that surrounded this poor fella, and pretty much, and I know that Rodney King is dead, may he rest in peace, but it's like when you're just looking back at this particular issue and seeing how these cops are actually just wailing and just hurling around and just continuously beating this fella. And I mean, it's like he can barely move, and he's just standing there just pretty much just really enduring all of this, all of this negative, energies that's given to him by these police officers simply because of the color of his skin. And see, one of the main thing about it is, again, is that we are reminded of, again, the concept of white privilege. I mean, how many times have you actually ran into it, or went in a neighborhood, or actually heard on the news, or read in the newspaper, where you actually have, blacks being pulled over because, of simply of who they are. They may be in a specific car that the white folks feel that they shouldn't be in, or they're in a side of town where they really figure that, black folks don't really need to be over, over in that sort of area. We face a lot of that type of issues like that here in the South, and unfortunately, that's where you have racial profiling gone wrong. It's like, can't a black person live in a nice neighborhood in a suburb now? I mean, come on. We're not in the 60s or 70s where you would like to have all of the black folks in the ghetto. I mean, again, times have changed, not necessarily the attitudes of most bigots, but the thing about it is, again, is that racial profiling always goes on. And it's like, again, and the sad fact about it is then you have the Trayvon Martin case where, this poor fellow was actually, targeted, so to speak, as news reports say, because of the color of his skin. They want to sit there and say that, they heard crime in the area, and they want to, and, all of a sudden make him seem as if this young fella here was the perpetrator, of those particular crimes. And pretty much, for the most part, when all of the research and everything has been done wrong, it was like, okay, this guy was actually, targeted. And even when, the fellow who was the perpetrator, who was actually accused of killing him, when they told him not to trail him and follow him, this fella kept doing that simply because, again, racial profiling. He looks like he's up to no good. And see, one thing about it is that I hate when, society wants to all of a sudden point the finger at blacks and say that you're the reason why crime you're the reason why this, that, and the other goes. Because again, black folks are not the only folks that commit crimes. Hello. I mean, you have, white society that commits crimes, but yet still they want to turn around and pin it on the African Americans because, again, for the most part, in some instances we're too gullible, and we fall right into the trap that for the most part white folks may set up for us. But going back to the issue with the Rodney King uh, fiasco, it was actually really unique in how this particular whole case actually played out. The cops and everything, went and had their day in court and all this other type of stuff here. But what really hit the fan is the fact that when they actually, for the most part, acquitted these officers of, actually of, I guess, really I guess not, they were acquitted for really for I guess they were saying that they were justified on their force on how they beat Rodney King. And for the most part, when that happened, something unique, it really sparked outrage in the African American community. And see, one thing about it is, again, is that, we had a right as African Americans to feel angry. I mean, there should not have been not one, nerve that should not have been pinched across the United States when it came to African Americans. I mean, again, we saw, how the OJ trial, played out and all this other type of stuff here. But, and all of these type of things is fueled into one because, again, here we go. We're talking about, the injustice that's being done to an African American at the hands of a white person, and the fact about it is that they had to move this case, and actually had to be specific in how they handle the case because again they did not want to actually spark an outcry of injustice, which of course ended up happening that way anyway because again they had a jury that acquitted these people of or I shouldn't say these people because even when I mention people that's just giving them too much credit. I would say that they acquitted these bigots of any type of mishandling of their police duties. And pretty much for the most part, what happened, and this is what made me angry with the black folks, is that we actually had to go out there and show America our behinds. We were not, we weren't just content with actually just, voicing our outcry and injustice of what went on. We actually had to go and actually show America pretty much how angry we were by really disrupting our own communities. And see, one thing about it is that it's okay to actually be angry, but why in the world would you actually go and trash your own communities to try to make a point of, your disapproval of how the justice system handled that particular case? See, one thing about it is that African Americans, we as black folks, we really have not actually really, in my opinion, mastered the art of actually being able to control our emotions. And see, one thing about it is that, again, America would expect for us to act this way because, again, we are already known as actually being combative, not being able to really be able to sit down and really hold our own in a peaceful manner. But see, when we actually did that and actually went in there and broke into, our stores, setting places on fire, and just being disruptive, pretty much we actually gave America a reason to actually classify us as being, uncontrollable. And again, that pretty much, perpetuates the stereotypes that already exist for African Americans today. So again, it's like it really did not really make much sense on how we actually trashed our own communities based on the rulings of what white society gave to these cops when they acquitted them for beating Mr. Rodney King. And it's very sad because again, you sit up there and you really try to educate our own on, not really allowing, white folks to really get the best of us. But yet still, in that particular time frame, just rewinding back in time, we really allowed them to see us in our true nature. I mean, we can't control our emotions. And even now to this day and time, when somebody happens to call us out a name, that we feel that we don't deserve, the first thing we're ready to do is to show our emotions and fight. And next thing you know, you end up with a lawsuit because you put your hands on somebody. Regardless of the fact of whether or not they deserved it, the fact is that you could not keep your emotions in check. And see, we have to show the world that we are better people than that. That you can insult us all you want, but I'm not going to let you to get the best of what I am and who I am. I know where I came from, and I know pretty much, my heritage, so to speak. But yet still, I don't have to let that dictate how you treat me. But I'm definitely not going to allow that to actually allow that to get the best of me when it comes to my emotions and how I handle injustices when it's done and brought in my direction. And see, again, we as African Americans, again, we have yet to really understand that and really know what that means when we're actually, being tested, so to speak. Again, the purpose of this entire presentation is just to give you a basic understanding of what I meant by under the scope of white privilege, and pretty much my response to the guy that responded to me in response to a video that I did to J Love. I mean, I didn't want to actually go and actually make it this broad and this sort of thing, but I really wanted America to understand, what our culture has gone through, and pretty much what we're continuing to go through. But again, even though white privilege exists, we still have to be able to conduct ourselves as classy African Americans. We're not apes. We didn't come from the ape family, and and all this other type of BS that evolution may have taught us about where we came from. I'm a human being. I did not come from an ape. Okay, I am a sovereign human being, and I deserve to be treated as such. It's okay for me to get angry, but again, just because you get angry, that doesn't mean that I'm actually going to allow you to stereotype me and put me into the perception of what you think I already might be, just because of where my ancestors have came from and what they may have endured. So that's all that I have for now, and I hope that somebody got something out of this, because again, this was something that was very important to me, and I just wanted to actually take the time out to put my say in it. So peace out and have a good one. Thanks.